It's going to be one of the most exciting fights that y'all have seen in a long time. And Eddie Gregory won't go past round 4. James Scott, the uncrowned light heavyweight champion.
James Scott lived one of the most extraordinary and controversial lives in boxing history. A man who fought world-class contenders from behind prison walls, Scott earned respect not through fame or celebrity, but through pure, undeniable talent.
In order for Scott to do something, he's got to come toward Martin, take the play away, and force the action. He gives Martin time to punch, time to think.
Fighters feared his pressure, admired his toughness, and respected his relentless will to win. But behind the warrior was a student of the sport, a man who studied styles, admired greatness, and understood the art of boxing on a deeper level than most champions ever do.
At least that we know about.
For decades, fans wondered which fighters Scott himself admired the most, which champions inspired him, which warriors matched his own fire, discipline, and heart. Now, for the first time, we explore James Scott's personal list of the 10 greatest fighters he ever respected, from rugged brawlers to technical masters.
Good round for Scott after.
These are the boxers who shaped his philosophy, influenced his style, and earned his admiration. Let's count them down. 10. Matthew Saad Muhammad. James Scott always held a deep admiration for Matthew Saad Muhammad, a fighter whose toughness bordered on myth. Scott respected many warriors throughout his career, but Saad Muhammad embodied something different, an almost supernatural ability to absorb punishment and come roaring back. Scott loved how Saad Muhammad turned his fights into dramas, battles where he appeared moments from defeat before suddenly flipping the script with a surge of brutal offense. What resonated most with Scott was Saad Muhammad's fearlessness. No matter how dangerous the opponent or how terrible the situation, he never stopped pressing forward. 9. Marvin Johnson. Marvin Pops Johnson impressed James Scott because he was the type of fighter who didn't understand the meaning of easy night. Scott admired Johnson's lethal left hand, his suffocating pressure, and his willingness to step into harm's way to land his best shots. But beyond the physical tools, Scott appreciated Johnson's mentality, cold, disciplined, and always purposeful. Johnson was a fighter who never complained about tough matchups. He wanted them. Scott saw in him a reflection of the old-school mentality that defined the light heavyweight era. Fight anyone, anywhere, anytime. 8. Eddie Mustafa Muhammad. James Scott always had a unique respect for Eddie Mustafa Muhammad's style. Smooth, sharp, and deceptively dangerous. Unlike the brawlers Scott usually admired, Eddie fought with a calculated coolness that reminded him of a chess player. Scott loved the way Eddie controlled the pace of a fight, using timing, footwork, and precise counterpunching to break opponents down. Eddie wasn't just strong, he was intelligent, a boxer who mastered the art of doing more with less. Scott admired how Eddie fought with no wasted movement, no unnecessary risks. Everything Eddie did, whether slipping a jab or setting up a power shot, was executed with professional precision. Scott respected that level of mastery because he knew how difficult it was to achieve. 7. Benny Briscoe. To James Scott. Benny Briscoe was the embodiment of Philadelphia grit, a fighter who carried toughness like a badge of honor. Scott admired Briscoe's durability most of all. Benny wasn't just hard to beat, he was nearly impossible to hurt. Every fight he entered felt like a test of will, and Scott respected the way Briscoe always pushed forward, forcing opponents into uncomfortable, exhausting brawls. Scott also appreciated Briscoe's simplicity. His style wasn't elaborate or strategic, it was raw, honest fighting. Jab, pressure, short hooks, and relentless determination. Briscoe could turn any bout into a street fight, and Scott admired the purity of that aggression. 6. Dwight Muhammad Qawi. James Scott considered Dwight Muhammad Qawi one of the toughest fighters he had ever seen. A man built like a tank with the discipline of a soldier. Scott admired how Qawi, shorter than most opponents, turned his size into an advantage, slipping inside punches and hammering opponents with relentless combinations. Scott loved Qawi's smothering style, describing it as a storm you couldn't escape from. What Scott respected most was Qawi's determination. Qawi's path to boxing wasn't easy, yet he fought with the maturity of someone who understood hardship intimately. Scott often said that Qawi never wasted a second in the ring. Every movement had a purpose, every punch had weight. Scott admired how Qawi beat larger men with intelligence, pressure, and impeccable conditioning. 5. Michael Spinks. James Scott admired Michael Spinks for one powerful reason. He mastered the art of solving problems inside the ring. Unlike many fighters who relied solely on toughness or aggression, Spinks used creativity, awkward rhythm, and strategic unpredictability to dismantle opponents. Scott loved that about him. Spinks didn't fight like anyone else. His timing was offbeat, his angles were unusual, and his famous Spinks Jinx right hand could end a fight instantly. What impressed Scott most was how Spinks handled pressure. When facing the biggest moments of his career, whether against Larry Holmes IV, Victor Galindez, James Scott had a deep respect for Victor Galindez, a champion whose iron will and granite chin became legendary. Scott admired how Galindez fought with a relentless, grinding style that wore opponents down over time. He was never in a hurry. He stalked his opponents, absorbed their best shots, and slowly broke them apart. Scott saw Galindez as a master of controlled chaos, thriving in long, brutal battles that tested a fighter's soul. What Scott appreciated most was Galindez's durability. This was a man who walked through punches that would have toppled others. A man who treated pain like an inconvenience rather than a threat. 3. Bob Foster. Bob Foster was the kind of fighter James Scott believed only comes around once every few generations. Foster's punching power was so devastating that Scott often described it as superhuman. He admired how Foster used his long, whip-like reach to deliver knockout blows that were as sharp as they were destructive. But Scott didn't only admire Foster for power, he admired the discipline behind it. Foster knew exactly how to use his physical gifts. He kept opponents at the end of his jab, forced them to take risks, and punished them when they did. Scott appreciated that strategic brilliance. Foster was a deadly mix of precision and violence, and Scott respected how he maintained control even in the most dangerous exchanges. 2. Archie Moore. Archie Moore stood as one of James Scott's greatest inspirations, a man whose longevity and ring intelligence seemed almost supernatural. Scott admired Moore's ability to reinvent himself over decades, adjusting his style with age, but never losing effectiveness. Moore was the perfect example of what Scott valued most: mastery through experience. Scott often praised Moore's old-school wisdom. Every move Moore made had purpose. Every punch had history behind it. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest, but Scott believed Moore was the smartest fighter to ever step into the ring. His famous cross-arm defense, his perfectly timed counters, and his ability to outthink younger, stronger opponents deeply influenced Scott's own understanding of boxing. 1. Ezzard Charles. Ezzard Charles was, to James Scott, the closest thing boxing had to perfection. Scott revered him not just as a fighter, but as the ideal blend of technique, intelligence, courage, and adaptability. Charles could brawl when he needed to, box when he had to, and think his way through any situation. Scott admired how Charles conquered multiple divisions, heavyweight, light heavyweight, and middleweight, without ever relying on brute force. What Scott valued most was Charles's calmness. No matter how dangerous the opponent, whether it was Joe Louis, Jersey Joe Walcott, or Charlie Burley, Charles fought with composure, making complex movements look effortless. Scott believed Charles was the most complete fighter in history, a man whose skill set had no weaknesses. James Scott's list reveals something important, not just about boxing, but about the man himself. He didn't admire flashy names or media favorites. He respected grit. He respected intelligence. He respected fighters who overcame adversity, pushed through pain, and fought with a sense of purpose. His favorites weren't picked from highlight reels. They were chosen from character, heart, and mastery. Each name on this list reflects a different part of Scott's own journey. The toughness of Galindez, the intelligence of Archie Moore, the power of Bob Foster, and the completeness of Ezzard Charles. These fighters weren't just athletes to Scott. They were teachers, inspirations, and reminders of the warrior spirit he lived by. If you enjoyed this deep dive into boxing history, Make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful storytelling.